The village, tucked away in the folds of the European countryside, lay in a tense stillness that seemed to defy time. It was a small, peaceful settlement, nestled between rolling hills, its narrow streets winding through humble homes and fields that stretched out towards the horizon. It was the kind of place where life moved slowly, where neighbors knew each other's names, and children played in the sun without a care in the world. But that peace was now shattered by an invisible threat that loomed on the horizon. As the first light of dawn broke over the village, the air was thick with an ominous sense of dread. The villagers had long since stopped trusting the sound of the wind through the trees or the murmur of distant voices. The only sound that mattered now was the silent anticipation of what was to come. Rumors had spread like wildfire in the days leading up to that fateful morning. Whispers of an enemy advancing from the east had made their way through the village, growing in intensity with each passing hour. The occupying forces were known for their ruthlessness, their cruelty towards the innocent civilians caught in their path. There had been no assurances, no promises of safety. The villagers knew that when the soldiers came, they would bring with them suffering and hardship, the likes of which they could hardly imagine. The stories from neighboring towns told of homes burned to the ground, of families torn apart, of lives lost without so much as a moment's mercy. The villagers had no reason to believe their fate would be any different. As the first rays of sunlight touched the earth, the people of the village had already gathered in their homes, locking doors and pulling shutters tightly shut. They had no choice but to wait. The fear was palpable, thick in the air, settling over them like a heavy fog. It was the kind of fear that gripped the heart and held it in place, making every breath a struggle. The children, who had once played and laughed freely in the streets, now huddled in corners, their wide eyes reflecting the anxiety of their parents. The elders, once the pillars of the community, now sat silently in their chairs, lost in thought, perhaps trying to make sense of the madness that had come to their doorstep. The village was holding its breath. It was as if the land itself, the soil beneath their feet, could sense the tension in the air. It was a quiet, eerie stillness, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind, the faint murmur of voices inside homes. And yet, beneath that surface calm, the villagers were trembling. They had long ago come to terms with the idea that their peaceful existence was coming to an end. The question was no longer whether or not the enemy would arrive, but when and what form their cruelty would take. They had heard the stories, and they knew that the forces advancing upon them were notorious for their brutality. The soldiers who came through the village gates would not offer mercy or compassion. They would take what they wanted and leave destruction in their wake. The villagers had seen it before in the eyes of those who had come through earlier towns. There was no escaping it. There was no fighting it. As the morning wore on, the air grew heavier. The sounds of birds singing in the trees, the quiet murmur of the river flowing through the village, all seemed distant and irrelevant. All that mattered now was the heavy silence that hung between the people, the knowledge that their world was about to change, perhaps forever. They tried to prepare themselves, but there was no real preparation for something like this. How does one prepare for the loss of everything they know, everything they have worked for? How do you prepare your heart for the inevitable pain that will come when your world is ripped apart? And then, as if in answer to their silent prayers, something remarkable happened. A sound, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing moment, broke through the heavy silence. It was the sound of engines, the rumble of something large moving through the air. At first, the villagers held their breath, unsure of what it meant. Could it be the enemy? Had they come earlier than expected? But no, this was something different. It wasn't the heavy, menacing sound of military vehicles rolling through the streets. No, this was something else, a different kind of rumbling. The people could not place it, and for a moment, it gave them pause. As the sound grew louder, so did the tension. The villagers strained their ears, trying to make sense of it. The soldiers were coming, they knew that. But this sound didn't seem to match the kind of force they had been dreading. It was a strange, foreign noise that didn't fit with their expectations. It was a sound that seemed almost hopeful, but they couldn't allow themselves to believe it. No, hope was something that had long since left them. Hope was for those who hadn't seen the horrors of war, who hadn't lived through the years of suffering. The villagers had grown accustomed to the thought of cruelty. They had stopped looking for anything good to come out of this war. It was too late for that. But as the sound drew nearer, there was no denying it. It wasn't the enemy they had expected. It was something else entirely. Something that, for a moment, made them question everything they had come to believe. The vehicles, they realized, were not the cold, intimidating ones they had feared. They were something different. They were British. British soldiers, their insignia visible even from a distance, marching into the village with an unexpected sense of purpose. The sight of them was so shocking that it took the villagers a moment to process what they were seeing. They had not anticipated this. They had not prepared for the possibility of mercy, of kindness. The British soldiers, weary from their long march, were not there to bring more pain. They were not there to destroy or conquer. The villagers could hardly believe their eyes. They watched as the British soldiers began to move through the streets, not with the aggression they had expected, but with an unexpected tenderness. They stopped to help the elderly, offering water to the thirsty, food to those who had not eaten for days. It was a moment of profound dissonance. The soldiers had come to liberate, not to oppress. And in that simple, unexpected act, everything the villagers had believed about the war, about humanity, began to change. For the first time in days, the villagers allowed themselves to exhale. The weight in their chests, the crushing fear that had bound them, began to lift. But it wasn't gone. Not yet. It was still there, lurking beneath the surface, the quiet realization that this could all change again. That the kindness they were experiencing now could be fleeting. They had been through too much, seen too much, to believe that kindness would endure. But in this moment, as the British soldiers moved through their streets with compassion, something shifted in the village. The villagers dared to hope, just for a moment. And for the first time since the enemy had begun its march towards them, the village allowed itself to breathe again. The morning had arrived with an unsettling calm, but as the hours dragged on, the stillness of the village began to dissolve under the weight of anticipation. The villagers, who had spent the night listening to the distant sounds of war, the rumble of trucks and the crackle of static on the radio, now waited in quiet dread. It wasn't just the physical presence of the enemy that they feared, it was the promise of suffering that they knew would follow. They had seen it in the neighboring towns and villages, the brutal, unrelenting nature of an occupation that stripped people of their dignity and their lives. The village was small, its streets narrow and unassuming, but its people were about to find out just how quickly the tides of war could turn their world upside down. By the time the first rays of sunlight had disappeared behind a haze of gray clouds, the atmosphere had shifted. The villagers could feel it in their bones. The arrival of the enemy was imminent. The elders, with their knowledge of history and the toll of past invasions, had already begun to prepare. There were quiet discussions behind closed doors, shared glances that spoke volumes, and hands that shook as they worked to secure their homes. The enemy would not be kind, and there would be no mercy offered to those who resisted or even stood in their way. The soldiers that came would take what they needed and leave destruction in their wake. It was a certainty that had been ingrained in the villagers' minds. The families huddled together in their homes, the windows closed tight against the world outside. The younger children clung to their mothers, their innocent faces clouded with confusion and fear. The older children, who had grown accustomed to the harsh realities of the war, stood silently by their windows, watching for signs of movement, their hearts racing in their chests. The mothers whispered quiet reassurances, but their voices trembled, betraying the anxiety they tried to mask. The fathers, who had once been the protectors, now felt helpless in the face of the approaching soldiers. They had no weapons to defend their families, no way to fight back against the ruthless force they knew would soon come crashing through their peaceful village. The streets were unnervingly silent, save for the faint rustle of leaves in the trees and the distant murmur of the river that ran along the edge of the village. It was as though the entire village had drawn a collective breath, holding it in the hope that the enemy might pass them by, that they might escape the wrath of the occupation. But deep down, the villagers knew it was only a matter of time. They had seen what had happened to other places, how the soldiers came, demanding food and shelter, taking what they wanted without question, and leaving families torn apart in their wake. Then, as the day wore on, the sound they had all been dreading finally reached them, the unmistakable, ominous rumble of engines in the distance. It was a sound they had been taught to fear, a sound that meant destruction, pain, and loss. The soldiers were here. The village stood on the brink of invasion, the dark cloud of uncertainty hanging over them like a storm ready to break. The families inside their homes grew more tense as the rumble grew louder, closer. The children's eyes darted to their parents, seeking comfort that no one could provide. The air seemed to grow heavier with each passing minute, and the villagers, who had lived their lives in peace, now found themselves thrust into the jaws of war. The first signs of the enemy's arrival were subtle, almost imperceptible. The ground vibrated beneath their feet as military trucks rolled down the village's main road. The low growl of the engines became louder, reverberating through the walls of the homes. The villagers held their breath. The enemy was not yet visible, but the unmistakable sound of marching feet and the clinking of weapons signaled that the time of waiting had ended. It was no longer a question of if the soldiers would come, but when. The villagers knew what would follow. They had no illusions about what the soldiers represented. In the streets, the shadows grew longer, and the village seemed to shrink in on itself, its narrow lanes now full of tension and fear. The first soldiers appeared at the edge of the village, their figures dark and foreboding against the fading light. The villagers watched through cracks in their windows, their hearts pounding in their chests. The soldiers moved in unison, their boots striking the ground with a rhythmic, almost mechanical precision. The sight was both mesmerizing and terrifying. The invaders were here, and there was nothing the villagers could do to stop them. The soldiers, clad in their military uniforms, advanced without a word, their presence crushing the fragile hope the villagers had held onto for so long. The people who had once known only the rhythm of the seasons, the cycle of planting and harvesting, were now confronted with a force they could neither understand nor resist. The fear that had been simmering for days now boiled over, flooding the hearts of every man, woman, and child in the village. It was a fear that had no shape, no form, but was all-encompassing, an invisible force that suffocated them as surely as the smoke that rose from the burning homes of villages destroyed in the wake of the enemy's advance. As the soldiers made their way deeper into the village, the streets seemed to narrow, the space between the houses closing in. The villagers stood motionless, watching as the enemy closed in, each step bringing them closer to the inevitable. The soldiers spoke in harsh, guttural tones, their voices carrying over the quiet murmurs of the villagers. The people held their breath, waiting for the first sign of violence to break the silence. They knew it was coming, but they couldn't anticipate when it would happen. The soldiers were methodical, moving with a sense of purpose that betrayed their experience. They were trained to subjugate, to control, and the villagers had no illusions about the fate that awaited them. The first door was kicked open with a force that sent a shiver through the entire village. The soldiers entered without hesitation, their presence imposing and domineering. They didn't bother with pleasantries or introductions. The villagers, who had once greeted strangers with open arms, now stood paralyzed in the face of the unexpected threat. The soldiers began to move through the streets with an eerie calm, their eyes scanning the homes, their rifles held firmly in their hands. The villagers couldn't look away. The fear was too intense to allow them to turn their gaze. The soldiers' arrival was not accompanied by the chaos or frenzy the villagers had expected. There were no shouts, no orders barked loudly at the terrified civilians. Instead, there was a quiet, terrifying efficiency to the way the soldiers moved through the village. Each action seemed deliberate, practiced. The enemy had arrived, and they were taking control of everything, one calculated step at a time. The villagers, helpless to stop it, could only watch in silence, their hearts breaking under the weight of what was happening. The soldiers, however, did not immediately resort to violence. Instead, they began to gather the villagers in the streets, forcing them to stand in a haphazard line. The men, women, and children stood side by side, trembling, their eyes cast downward, trying to avoid the penetrating gaze of the soldiers. The enemy had come to claim their village, and the villagers had no choice but to surrender to their fate. The quiet anticipation in the air grew heavier as the soldiers began to move amongst the people, their presence a constant reminder of the war that had torn through the world, leaving a wake of destruction in its path. The villagers' hearts beat as one in their shared fear, their collective breath held in the face of this sudden, unexpected encounter. As the soldiers moved closer, the reality of their situation became all too clear. The village, once so peaceful and serene, was now at the mercy of a force they could neither comprehend nor escape. In the space of a few short hours, everything had changed. They were no longer safe. They were no longer in control. The village, as they had known it, had been shattered, and all that remained was the quiet terror of what would come next. The rumbling of engines in the distance had been a harbinger of fear, but what followed in its wake was far from the terror the villagers had braced themselves for. The first signs of the British forces' arrival were subtle. At first, they seemed to blend in with the ominous march of the enemy, an unfamiliar but somehow reassuring presence amidst the tension. But as the roar of military trucks became clearer, it was evident that this was something altogether different. The air, heavy with the threat of imminent danger, shifted, almost imperceptibly, as though the very earth beneath the villagers' feet had paused to take in what was unfolding. The soldiers, with their distinct uniforms and accents, emerged in the heart of the village, and what was expected to be a force of oppression instead took the shape of something else entirely, a promise of something that the villagers could not yet understand but would come to cherish. The enemy they had anticipated did not arrive. The British forces, whose arrival had been a distant hope for many, were here, but not in the brutal form they had feared. At first, the sight of the British soldiers, battle-worn, weary, yet undeniably human, struck the villagers with disbelief. These were not the cold, ruthless men they had been taught to expect. They were soldiers, yes, but there was something different about them, something that could not be fully understood in that first, fleeting moment of recognition. The villagers watched from their windows, their eyes wide with a mix of awe and confusion. They had spent the better part of the morning preparing for violence and destruction, bracing themselves for what they had been told to expect. But what they saw instead were soldiers who appeared to move with an almost gentle deliberation, their steps slow and careful, as though they understood the magnitude of their actions. The British soldiers did not enter the village as conquerors, but as individuals bound by something greater than the war itself. It was in the way they looked at the villagers, not with the coldness that marked the presence of the enemy, but with empathy. As they moved through the streets, offering quiet words and gestures, the villagers began to take in the impossible. These men were here to help, not to harm. Slowly, the distance between the soldiers and the villagers began to shrink. The soldiers approached cautiously, aware of the fear that lingered in the air, but determined to ease it. They offered small tokens of comfort, food, water, blankets. They spoke to the villagers in a way that was foreign in its kindness. There were no threats, no demands. There was only an unspoken understanding that the soldiers, though battle-weary and scarred by their own experiences, still carried within them the capacity for compassion. For the first time in days, the villagers allowed themselves to breathe, though tentatively. They had been holding their breath since the early morning, waiting for the brutality they had come to expect. But as the soldiers moved among them, offering what little they could, it became clear that the village had encountered something different, an unfamiliar face of war. The fear that had held the village in its grip now began to dissipate, like fog lifting in the morning sun. It wasn't gone entirely, but it had been replaced by a sense of cautious hope, the kind of hope that blooms in the cracks of despair, fragile and tentative but undeniable. The soldiers were not there to simply liberate the village. They were there to ensure that the people survived, that they endured the horrors of war not just physically but emotionally as well. They knew the toll that the conflict had taken on the civilian populations, and they understood that a war is fought not only with weapons but with the hearts and minds of those caught in its wake. What the soldiers offered was more than just food and supplies. They offered humanity in the form of simple acts, a hand extended to help someone up, a smile exchanged between strangers, a quiet word of comfort spoken when it seemed there was nothing left to say. In a world torn apart by violence, these small gestures of kindness became a lifeline. The villagers who had been preparing for a nightmare now found themselves in a situation they had never imagined. They were being treated with dignity. The soldiers, having endured their own battles, understood that the pain of war was not limited to the battlefield. It was something that seeped into the lives of the innocent, something that left scars that were not always visible. As they interacted with the villagers, they did not see them as victims to be pitied, but as people to be respected, as fellow humans struggling to survive in the same world. There was no arrogance in their actions, no sense of superiority. The soldiers knew that their position was not one of power over the villagers, but of solidarity in the face of a common enemy. The village, though still steeped in the uncertainty of war, began to change in small, profound ways. The streets, once heavy with the silence of fear, were now filled with quiet conversations as villagers spoke with the soldiers, sharing stories of their lives, of their families, of the horrors they had witnessed. The soldiers, in turn, shared their own stories, of the battles they had fought, of the loss they had experienced, and of the hopes they still held for the future. In those conversations, the barriers between the soldiers and the villagers began to crumble. It wasn't just a question of soldiers helping civilians, it was a moment of shared humanity, of people connecting in the midst of chaos. The first signs of warmth were tentative. The villagers didn't trust the soldiers completely, not yet. The kindness they were being shown was too foreign, too unexpected to be fully accepted. But over time, that kindness began to take root. As the soldiers continued to move through the village, offering whatever help they could, the villagers' apprehension began to melt away, replaced by a quiet sense of gratitude. The fear, which had gripped them so tightly in the early hours of the day, began to loosen its hold. The villagers still carried the weight of what had happened to them, of the brutality they had witnessed in other towns and villages, of the knowledge that the war was not over, but there was something else now, too. There was a flicker of hope, something they had thought lost in the face of war's cruelty. The soldiers, for their part, continued to act with humility. They never overestimated their role in the village, never assumed that they were the saviors. Instead, they moved through the village with a quiet understanding, knowing that they could not undo the suffering that had already taken place, but they could offer the villagers something that had been sorely missing: kindness. It was a small thing, but in the face of so much destruction, it became something precious, something worth holding on to. The villagers, who had once feared that their lives would be forever marked by suffering, began to see a different possibility, that even in the darkest moments, there could be light. The presence of the British soldiers in the village was not an immediate solution to the suffering that the war had caused. There was no magic that could erase the pain and the scars that had already been etched into the lives of the villagers. But in that small, quiet village, on that seemingly ordinary day, something extraordinary had happened. The soldiers had arrived not as conquerors, but as human beings who understood what it meant to live through war, to survive it. And in the process, they had given the villagers something far more valuable than food or shelter. They had given them a glimpse of what it meant to be treated with dignity, with respect, with humanity. The village, once consumed by fear and uncertainty, was now a place where hope could begin to grow once more. The days following the British soldiers' arrival were a strange mixture of disbelief and cautious optimism. The villagers, who had braced themselves for the worst, found themselves immersed in an unexpected and almost surreal experience. It was difficult for them to reconcile the harsh reality of war with the compassion they were now witnessing. They had been prepared for violence, for destruction, for the cold, dehumanizing presence of the enemy. But instead, what they found in the British soldiers was something far more elusive: humanity. The soldiers did not impose their authority upon the villagers. They did not claim the village as their own, nor did they assume the kind of superiority that often comes with military power. Instead, they acted with a quiet grace, offering help without expectation, and in doing so, they began to transform the atmosphere of fear that had dominated the village for so long. It was not just the soldiers' actions that had a profound impact, but the way in which they moved through the village. They seemed to understand that their presence would only be meaningful if it was rooted in respect for the villagers. They offered their assistance without condescension, without the assumption that the people of the village were helpless. There was a quiet dignity in the way the soldiers interacted with the villagers, a dignity that stood in stark contrast to the brutal force that had arrived in other towns. The villagers had lived through enough to know that the behavior of the soldiers was not something to take for granted. But as the days wore on, they began to see that the kindness being offered was genuine, and that made all the difference. In the early days, The soldiers had focused on the immediate needs of the villagers. They distributed food, medical supplies, and blankets to those who were struggling the most. They tended to the sick, bandaging wounds that had festered from the lack of proper care. They offered solace to the grieving, understanding that the emotional scars of war could be as deep as the physical ones. What was remarkable, however, was not just the provision of these basic necessities, but the way in which the soldiers communicated with the villagers. There was no urgency, no rush to accomplish their task and move on to the next. Instead, the soldiers took their time, speaking with the villagers, listening to their stories, and offering words of comfort. They made it clear that they were not just there to take care of the physical needs of the people, but to acknowledge their suffering, to help them heal in whatever way they could. The villagers, at first hesitant and unsure of what to make of the soldiers, began to open up. The fear that had kept them silent for so long began to dissipate, replaced by a quiet sense of relief. The soldiers had become more than just a presence of military might. They had become something else entirely, a symbol of hope. The villagers had long since abandoned the belief that anyone would come to help them, to protect them from the ravages of war. But now, as they sat in the company of the soldiers, they realized that help had come, and it came in the form of compassion, not brutality. It was a lesson that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The change that began to take place in the village was not just physical but emotional as well. The villagers had spent so much of the past years hiding from the horrors of war, trying to protect themselves and their families from the brutality they knew would eventually come. They had learned to lock away their fears and their grief, to pretend that they were immune to the violence and loss that surrounded them. But in the days that followed the arrival of the British soldiers, the villagers began to release the tension they had been holding for so long. They began to share their stories, to speak of the pain they had endured. And in doing so, they began to heal. One of the most significant changes was in the way the villagers began to see themselves. For so long, they had been defined by the fear that had gripped them, by the brutal reality of their situation. But as the soldiers moved through their village, offering help, they began to see themselves not just as victims of war, but as survivors. They began to reclaim their sense of agency, their ability to endure, and in doing so, they rediscovered their strength. The soldiers' actions had not only brought material assistance, but they had reminded the villagers of their own resilience. They had reminded them that even in the darkest moments, there was the potential for light. The soldiers also began to help the villagers rebuild. It was not just a matter of giving food or medical supplies, but of restoring something deeper, something more vital, the villagers' sense of community. The soldiers worked alongside the villagers, helping to repair homes that had been damaged by the war, clearing debris, and assisting in the rebuilding of the infrastructure that had been decimated. It was not a grand or dramatic effort, but it was one that spoke to the heart of what the soldiers were doing. They were not here to conquer or to impose their will. They were here to help rebuild, to restore dignity, and to offer a sense of normalcy in a world that had been turned upside down. The emotional transformation in the village was profound. At first, the villagers had seen the soldiers as little more than a necessary presence, a force that would temporarily ease the tension of their lives. But as the soldiers continued their work, the villagers began to see them in a different light. They were no longer just soldiers, they were people, real and human, who understood what it meant to suffer and to survive. They began to trust the soldiers, to see them as allies, not as invaders. The soldiers, in turn, treated the villagers with the respect they deserved, offering their assistance without judgment or expectation. In doing so, they had forged a bond that transcended the roles of soldier and civilian. It was a bond based on mutual respect, on the understanding that, in the end, they were all human, bound together by the shared experience of war. As the days turned into weeks, the villagers slowly began to rebuild their lives. They had lost so much, and they knew that the scars of war would remain with them for a long time. But in the presence of the soldiers, they found the strength to move forward. They found hope in the simple acts of kindness, in the shared moments of humanity that had once seemed so distant, so impossible. The soldiers had not come to the village to make grand gestures or to impose their will. They had come to offer something much more profound, a recognition of the villagers' suffering and a willingness to help them heal. The change that had taken place in the village was not one of sudden transformation, but one of gradual, profound progress. The villagers, who had once lived in constant fear, now began to live with the knowledge that there were forces in the world, however small and fleeting, that were capable of kindness and compassion. They had been shown a different face of war, one that was not about domination or destruction, but about restoration and healing. The village, which had once been consumed by fear and uncertainty, was now a place where hope could begin to grow again, slowly but surely. And at the heart of that transformation was the quiet, steadfast presence of the British soldiers, whose acts of kindness had shown the villagers that even in the darkest of times, there was still room for humanity. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the village began to change in ways that were not immediately apparent but were nonetheless profound. What had once been a place of dread and silence was now slowly becoming a space for recovery, not just physically, but emotionally and psychologically as well. The British soldiers had arrived as unlikely agents of mercy, but in the wake of their presence, they had ignited something in the villagers that they had thought lost forever: the will to rebuild, the determination to survive, and most unexpectedly, a newfound sense of dignity. The village, once marked by the shadow of war, now held the glimmers of something new, something fragile but undeniable: hope. The soldiers, though their mission was far from complete, had proven that there was more to war than the battlefields. It was not just about victory and defeat, but about the lives that hung in the balance between the two. The villagers had come to understand this truth slowly, as the soldiers continued their work not as conquerors but as healers. The physical repairs to the homes, the distribution of food and supplies, the tending to the wounded, all of this was vital, of course, but it was the less visible acts that left the deepest impression. The conversations, the gestures of kindness, the quiet moments spent offering comfort, these were the true healing forces. They were the ones that began to stitch the torn fabric of the village's soul back together. For the first time in years, the people of the village began to venture out into the streets again, albeit cautiously. It was no longer the ghost town it had been when the enemy forces arrived, but a place where life could, in small ways, begin again. People began to talk to one another more openly, sharing not just their fears, but their hopes for the future. Conversations that had once been hushed, filled with the weight of suppressed grief, now started to carry the quiet but unmistakable tone of rebuilding. The soldiers, for their part, never overestimated their impact, never assumed that they had the power to erase the scars of war. But in their presence, the villagers felt that they were no longer alone. The soldiers gave them something even more valuable than physical aid. They gave them the knowledge that they could still find strength within themselves, even when the world around them seemed so uncertain. The work of rebuilding, both tangible and intangible, continued steadily. Homes that had been destroyed in the wake of the conflict were slowly restored. The village began to regain its former shape, but now with the added resilience that comes from surviving great loss. Where once the streets had been lined with boarded-up windows and doors, now there was a gradual resurgence of life. Children began to play again in the streets, their laughter returning like the first rays of sunlight after a long storm. The older generation, who had seen so much suffering, now began to reconnect with the land. They planted crops again, sowing seeds of both literal and metaphorical growth. Though the work was slow and fraught with difficulty, the villagers moved forward with a quiet determination. They understood, perhaps better than anyone, that the path to healing was not immediate. It was a journey that required patience, compassion, and above all, the will to continue even when it seemed like the odds were insurmountable. The soldiers, too, had begun to forge connections with the people they had come to aid. They were no longer just a foreign presence in the village. They had become a part of its rhythm. They worked alongside the villagers, not as masters or occupiers, but as partners. The relationships that developed were not born out of obligation but out of mutual respect. The villagers, who had once seen them as invaders, now saw them as comrades, as men who had come to help, to shoulder the burden of the war together. The soldiers, in turn, recognized that their mission was about more than just military strategy. It was about restoring the human dignity that had been so carelessly stripped away in the wake of the conflict. They offered more than just their physical presence. They offered their time, their empathy, and their willingness to listen.